Our second speaker is Dr. Brendan Scott, who is the manager of the Irish Family History Foundation, author and editor of a number of books and essays relating to religion, society and trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the editor of the Brefna Journal. Two of his forthcoming publications are the Cavan entry in the Irish Historical Towns Atlas series with the Royal Irish Academy, and an edition of the Returns of the Royal Visitations of the Church of Ireland in 1622, published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission. Brendan is the editor of Society and Administration in Ulster's Plantation Towns, published by Four Courts Press in 2019. And his most recent book is an edited volume of essays, Bishop William Bedell, 1571 to 1642, His Life, Work and Contemporaries, published in 2025. And Brendan's going to speak to us on the subject of the Ulster Plantation Towns.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind invite to speak today. It's been a great day. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned an awful lot, including from Tom O'Connor the correct pronunciation of prosopography. So that's been very helpful. I don't mind writing the word, but I usually say a lisp, but I'm quite happy. Prosopography. Great. I would say as well that when I was driving up here today, I drove through 3 incorporated Ulster Plantation towns, Clogher and Enniskillen, and then arrived in Belfast here. And as someone I would just like to mention, whose second anniversary was just a few days ago, was the late Ray Gillespie, a proud Belfast man. And I thought of him when I was driving up today, because if anyone ever visited him in his office in Maynooth, where Tom worked with him for many years, the screensaver on his PC was the Belfast Charter. So he never forgot where he came from. And I just, as I say, it was his anniversary a few days ago, and I just wanted to remember him here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the plantation towns in a very broad way, because in 20-25 minutes, an hour, no. You can only do so much, and but I would point you towards a book that I edited a few years ago about Ulster Plantation towns, not because I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but because of the great articles that were in it. Paddy was in it, William was in it, Anna Lee was in it, and I missed a trick by not getting David Heffernan in it, but he wrote a nice review of it, so it all worked out well. But anyway, if you are interested, there's lots of good stuff in there if you want to learn more about this. So in the establishment, I suppose, of urban settlements as key components in any successful plantation had long been recognised by the English Crown. In the late 16th century, Edmund Spencer, himself a beneficiary of the Munster plantation, wrote in his view of the state of Ireland that nothing doth sooner cause any civility in any country than many market towns, by reason that people repairing thither for their needs will daily see and learn civil manners. Thomas Blennerhassett at Planter Basin Fermanagh stressed the importance of an urban network of incorporated towns, cities and boroughs in bringing what he believed to be civility to an untamed wild region. Towns in the colonial context were, as Willie Smith writes, frontier outposts created to dominate and reorganise hitherto hostile territories, and were, in his view, the central instruments of imperial expansion and control. Each plantation town was a manifestation and expression of the strength of colonial power and control, key components in the complex cultural landscape that had emerged as a result of colonialism across Ulster in the early 17th century. Fortifications were constructed, new streets laid out, and marketplaces established. The corporate status of the towns also meant that they contained a suite of administrative and cultural buildings with centralised functions such as churches, schools, markets, session houses and jails, what has been called the visual representation of the fundamental political change in the 6 planted counties. The Charter for Dungannon, for example, issued in November 1612, prioritised building projects in the town, such as the building of a parish church, a school and a marketplace. It said how many people should be settled there and the amount of land to be granted to them. And the plantation towns, are at least the newly built ones, generally comprised of long, wide, straight streets, maybe with, we've seen this map already, but I mean, if you're like if you go to Derry now, that'll get you around. You know where you're going. But hilariously, I did manage to go a wrong way down a one-way street in Derry one day, which went very well for me. But yeah, and then of course, then in the centre area there, you have what's called the Diamond area. And the streets would usually converge on the Diamond. There'll be a Church of Ireland church nearby, which I think is up in the top corner up there. And then there'll be a market house and maybe doubling as a sessions house and that kind of thing. Other towns like Armagh and Cavan retained their Gaelic character much more and didn't follow a lot of those forms and much more confused. And even if you drive around Armagh today, again, you kind of need to know where you're going because, and Irish style housing and modes of living and agriculture were to be outlawed in these towns and in the hinterland. And the Gaelic Irish were not permitted to live in the towns, but as Dave Heffernan pointed out there, I mean, they often were. Theory and practice are two very different things. I often think it's very easy for Whitehall to say, right, you shall do A, B, and C, but if you're stuck in the middle of Donegal in 1620 and you need tenants, you'll take whoever you can get, really. And so that was happening. Now, why are they trying to keep the Gaelic Irish out? Well, partly they want to stop the British settlers from going native. That's always a great fear of any colonial power. And the other was to lead by example, the expectation being that the Gaelic Irish, when faced with this superior form of civility, would see the error of their ways and adopt the British customs and practices. And through this means of cultural osmosis, the Stuart administration, through the activities of their settlers, hoped to transform Irish space into another England. It was also expected that the use of markets and commerce would have the desired effect of civilising the native Irish population, because nothing civilises like money. And it was noted in Dundrum in County Down, which is outside the official plantation. But again, as I think David said, or perhaps Andrew, I mean, like the plantation doesn't stop at a county border or county boundary. Like oftentimes these guys are buying up lands in neighbouring counties, which aren't like Colonial, which isn't like that has a diamond. And Castleblaney and Monaghan and all these different places. So it's not just as simple as the plantation stops here at this line. It seeps through. And so in Dundrum in Down, in 1629, it was noted that this notion of markets and commerce would be the means by which the rude and country people of that region may be led to a more humane and civil mode of life. Of course, this being early modern Ireland, the outcome was not as the Stuart administration may have expected or hoped. In Ulster, the decision regarding the location of these new towns was in the hands of the plantation commissioners, who by 1609 had identified 25 locations where corporate towns might be established. Now, some of these changed along the way, and there was some mention of that earlier. Some fell by the wayside, like in Omagh. The plan to incorporate Omagh was abandoned when it was realised that the land surrounding the town had been leased in 1610 to John Lee, who's the constable of the fort there, without any obligation on him to establish an urban settlement. So that was Omagh gone. The fort settlement in Mountjoy, which had been established to support communication across Lough Neagh, was no longer necessary. They didn't need that then, so it wasn't incorporated, so it fell off the list. But in any case, there was 15 towns incorporated between 1610 and 13, with 12 of those in 1613, and then there's a few outliers after that. Killybegs in 1615, Clogher in 1629, and St Johnson around 1630ish, or we're not entirely sure. But there's a map of the towns as they ended up being incorporated. So you can kind of tell the way I drove up to Belfast today along the line there. So, as I say, the ones that are in red are new ones that weren't on the original list, and then there's some of them that have fallen off, like Omagh in the middle there, and a few others as well. Now, some of the town sites to be incorporated were chosen for strategic reasons, like, as I say, when they were talking about Mountjoy, for example, but they fell off. So Belturbet in Cavan was situated on the banks of the Erne at a fording point, a good way to get in and out of South Ulster, so it was incorporated. Other charters were granted to pre-existing settlements, which were now regularised and brought under the control of the town. And a number of those incorporated towns had existed for centuries prior to the Ulster Plantation, including, as I said a minute ago, Cavan and Armagh. Carrickfergus in Antrim, and again outside the official plantation, they had a corporation certainly by 1375, maybe as early as 1260. By the 16th century, so before it got this new incorporation, Carrickfergus was a flourishing trading port, probably the unofficial capital of Ulster, really. And then there's other towns, as I said, like Ballyshannon, Coleraine, Derry, Carrickfergus, as I say. They're already thriving port towns before they were ever incorporated. Over the following years, these towns developed under the aegis of a diverse range of patrons, as we've seen already, from individual local landlords and corporations to the powerful London companies. Each had differing motivations, ambitions and abilities as urban developers, which accounted for the varied extent and appearance of those plantation towns. As to give an example, like Virginia and Belturbet and Cavan, Virginia was very slow to develop and missed out on getting a charter actually because it was so slow to develop. And Belturbet was soon the largest town in Cavan, and that was largely down to the dynamism or otherwise of their founders. And when the Earl of Abercorn died in 1618, he was complaining 4 years later that Strabane had languished and drooped, so it wasn't moving. Oftentimes it was the personal dynamism of the person pushing it along, and then when they went, then there wasn't that push afterwards. So I kind of want to talk about the municipal government of these towns and these charters, which conferred a wide range of powers on the corporations, which were the governing bodies of these incorporated towns. So the corporations were empowered to dispense law and justice, to hold fairs and markets, with details in the charters usually given regarding the dates for the holding of markets and fairs and that kind of thing. The charter also outlines the initial office holders from the sovereign or the portree, the mayor essentially, down to the burgesses, the freemen, a property minority who held positions on the corporation. And the leader of the corporation goes under different titles. In Ballyshannon and in Donegal he's the portree. In Killybeg, Strabane and Dungannon he's the provost. And in Derry and Carrickfergus he's mayor. And those municipal corporations were also parliamentary constituencies, each permitted to return 2 MPs to Parliament, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The main offices which required appointments, aside from the sovereign, was a vice sovereign, a sergeant of the mace, and a town clerk or recorder, the secretary essentially. The sovereign was normally also constituted a justice of the peace, a coroner and a clerk of the market, which entitled him to levy tolls on the fairs and markets held in the town. All prestigious and profitable posts he usually held to himself. The corporation received the profits from the fairs and markets. Now occasionally private individuals would make donations to the corporation. We saw Richard Hansard, who William showed there a moment ago, and as well as funding churches and all that sort of stuff. He also made financial provision for the corporation in Lifford in his will. The corporations not only had a great deal of economic autonomy, they also held a lot of centralised functions, such as the law courts, which normally took place in a specially built sessions house or the Thulsel, the town hall that would be in the area. And then a logical consequence of those courts was the presence of county jails in many of the corporate towns, and they show up in maps and in various records and minutes and so on, as do stocks as well. Stocks often show up for repairs to stocks, and the guy hired, to make the stocks, and these come up in the minutes in the expenditure place as well. And as I mentioned a minute ago, part of the reason for the incorporation of these towns was the political side of things. In the Parliament, which met in Dublin in 1613, it was proclaimed that for the better encouragement of the new plantations in Ulster, and generally for the drawing of inhabitants into such other places as were weakly peopled or dangerous in respect of their situations, His Majesty thought it meet to erect new corporations which would produce good effects for the strength of the kingdom. The Irish Parliament had, and I should remember as well, a great parliamentary historian who we lost last year as well, Bridget McGrath, who was another fine scholar of towns and parliaments in early modern Ireland. The Irish Parliament had long been viewed by the old English Catholic majority as a means of protecting itself against the Protestant Reformation and the rise of new English interests in Ireland. So long as they held the majority, there was a certain amount of protection. So each county returned 2 MPs to the House of Commons, along with 37 towns throughout Ireland, but only 2 of which were in Ulster, Carrickfergus and Downpatrick. And it was envisaged, as I said initially, that 25 Ulster towns would be incorporated, with the notion was exclusively Protestant membership. And so it's obvious that James I and the Dublin government were hoping to pack any new parliament with their own supporters, which is exactly what happened in that parliament from 1613 to 15. And so it was that the Catholic faction lost control of the Irish parliament. But the extirpation of Catholicism, one of the pillars on which the Ulster Plantation was built, in theory, did not always run smoothly, even from the inside. And again, William, and I think David has mentioned this, George Hamilton, the brother of the first Earl of Abercorn, who planted Strabane, was a Catholic. The family used their residences for religious services and so on. And much to the annoyance of Bishop George Downham of Derry, who accused Hamilton of planting popery there. And despite examples like Hamilton and the work of David Edwards, who wrote a lovely essay about a haven of popery, about British people, British Catholics moving to Ireland to get away from English scrutiny, the Reformation hadn't really impacted on Ulster before the early 17th century. And when parish churches came to be built on new estates, they were frequently constructed not on the traditional medieval sites that were inconvenient for the new settlement pattern, but rather in the newly established town where it was thought settlers would congregate. And here in Belfast, Arthur Chichester built a parish church for his new town, not on the traditional site at Shankill, but on the site of a medieval chapel at the ford across the Lagan, because it was more convenient for his new settlers. This was a common development in the Ulster Plantation. In the Conwall parish in Raphoe in 1622, it was noted that as the old parish church was now ruinated and decayed, being situated before in a remote waste place, it would be fitting to be transported to a market town called Letterkenny, where there is 80 families of British inhabitants within the midst of the parish. A similar example can be found in Belturbet in Cavan, which was in the parish of Anna. The commissioners reported in 1622 that although a Protestant cleric was living in the town, there was as yet no new church built, with Anna's pre-Reformation medieval parish church about 3-4 miles outside the town. So it was recommended by the commission in 1622 that as there were a great store of Protestants in and about the town, there should be a church built there. Thomas Moyne, who was the Church of Ireland Bishop of Kilmore, agreed with this recommendation, reporting in 1622 that the church is ruinous and unfit to be repaired by reason of the remoteness from Belturbet. A corporation newly erected is a place fit for a church to be built de novo. And you can find numerous examples of that across the province at this time. And I want to talk about the markets. I mean, incorporation generally went hand in hand with the granting of a market, which was such an important source of revenue for the town's corporation. And in many of the minutes which survived for the corporations at this time, the charges to be imposed upon sales at market and upon the traders themselves are noted, which gives an indication of the goods and the type of merchants operating in the towns during this period. Extra fees were charged if a trader erected a stall rather than sold their goods on the ground, which probably applied to visiting traders who would, there were traders who would just travel the island, going from market to market, fair to fair, and selling the wares wherever they went. But some towns also saw the development or repurposing of more permanent buildings as shops to handle burgeoning trade there. Belfast's economy seems to have been wealthy enough that by 1639 permanent structures were in situ at the marketplace rather than temporary stalls put up on the day of the market or the fair and then broken down again at the end of the day. And the fixed nature of those buildings, I think, indicates a confidence in the viability of the market and long-term plans of the settler community to remain where they were. Of course, 1639, 2 years later, comes 1641, so the best laid plans. The substantial income accruing from these markets and fairs meant that the rights attached to them were guarded jealously by town corporations. Colerane's corporation, for example, authorised in 1650 an official to investigate whether other markets were operating within 7 miles of Coleraine, and if there were, the corporation decreed that such course may be taken for vindication of the franchises and privileges of this corporation as shall be fitting. Likewise, it was written into Derry's charter that no other market could be held within 7 miles of the city, as such competition might attract traders and customers alike away from their town and its fairs and markets. And that was so jealously guarded because that was such an income spinner for the corporations. And there's also an element of town planning in these new towns, which can be seen in the separate areas which were developed in some towns for the buying and selling of animals, aside from the market square or the diamond. One example being what's called the cow market here in Belturbet in 1723, a few years later. But so this is the main street. I grew up just about in that house there, that one right there. And so this is what's now the Fair Green, was called the Cow Market. And then the actual diamond is there, sorry, the Church of Ireland church there, and then the town hall, the market house is called there, and the diamond just there. And again, you bring the cattle up around the back of the town because you don't want, the inevitable thing that happens when you have lots of livestock around. So it keeps the town a bit cleaner. And Belfast in 1639 attempted to control this issue as well by fining any traders who didn't keep their livestock in the pens provided. So they had pens there to go. And in fact, in the house I grew up in, which backed onto the thing there was a garage at the back of the house, and there was these huge chains, like massive, like a thing where you would tie your animals to. Like the fair ended there, I think, in the 60s, but the chains and the large things were there that you could still tie your animals to. So I'm assuming whoever lived there before we lost a money spinner there, unfortunately. What can you do? So like there were poor towns like Carrickfergus, whose market was held on what was described as a handsome large street, and they often, but not always, developed their markets close to quays. Coleraine Saturday Market was initially held outside the town before being moved within. And here's now this is the OS map for Donegal town. But again, if you look, like this is the diamond, and this is the area where you'd have the market. It opens up wide. The market house is right beside it. You're right beside the water here as well. And so the session house is there, a fish market. So everything kind of centralised in that sort of an area. And as I say, this is the widest part of the town. So you can get people in, you can get stalls in, and you can get selling whatever it is you need. But some of these areas weren't developed as well as it could be. And Derry's market area, immediately following the plantation, lacked the necessary storage facilities or even weights, even though the quay there was reckoned to be the largest in Ireland. While in Coleraine, the custom house was situated in the middle of the town, well away from the quay, and was described as being little bigger than a cobbler's shop, which was plainly an unsatisfactory situation for everyone involved. David here did a lovely article in Analecta a few years ago where you were able to get a great description of these towns around this time. And like an indication of the popularity and necessity of the markets can be seen in a comment given by a deponent in the 1641 depositions. And this observer remarked that Moneymore in County Londonderry was as full of Irish in the early days of the 1641 Rising as if it had been a market day. So obviously the Irish are coming in on those days. And just then to segue into the Gaelic Irish in the towns, as David here said already, I mean, they didn't really go away. They were still there. And there was a document entitled The Discourse for Reformation of Ulster by Colonies, which dates from 1598, pondering the failure of the Laois and Offaly plantations in the 1550s, and it pointed towards the letting of lands out to the native Irish as a main reason for the scheme's ultimate failure there. Only English tenants should be allowed in any future plantation of Ulster, it concluded. Yet, when the time for plantation came, just over a decade later, this advice and the hard-learned experience of previous plantation efforts fell on deaf ears. There was not always a huge effort made to remove the native Irish tenants from the towns and lands given over to the plantation. Landlords acclimatising themselves to the difficulties of attracting sufficient British planters were only too glad at times to accept the Irish on these lands. And so serious a problem was this that royal proclamations were issued every year between 1616 and 19, ordering Irish inhabitants to vacate the plantation towns, and fines were introduced in 1619 for native Irish tenants. But these fines were no deterrent, and as the undertakers found that the native Irish were willing, however reluctantly, to pay a higher rent. And again, back to Belturbet, in 1622 it was reported that there are many Irish dwelling upon it, and the British complain thereof generally that they can get no reasonable bargains till the Irish be removed. So the Irish are willing to pay a higher rent, and the English can't get a good deal because the Irish are paying a higher rent, which was generally a terrible deal for the Irish. It's normally a shorter lease on a higher rent. And that's okay when things are going good, but then when things go bad, as things do in the 1630s, there's a series of harvest failures and different things, of recession, suddenly you're not able to pay that high rent anymore, and that becomes a real problem then in 1641. And despite the orders that each plantation town was to be filled with English-style structures, it was reported in 1622 that Gaelic Irish house forms outnumbered the Irish-style 122 to 94 in the London Company villages in County Londonderry. Part of the reason for this was the failure of the planters to provide English-style housing. By 1622, of 20 individuals who had undertaken to build an Armagh, only 7 had actually done so. And unlike many of the towns that were granted a charter, Cavan Town retained much of its Gaelic character in the terms of the makeup of its corporation. There's lots of Irish names, Brady's and different things in that first charter. Cavan wasn't alone in that. In Other, in 1613, in this charter, there's an O'Reilly, must have snuck up from Cavan. He's one of the burgesses there. And although Armagh was redeveloped along standard plantation lines following its incorporation, it also held on to a large Gaelic population in the immediate years following. And some towns did make an effort to rid themselves of the Irish. The 1611 survey of Lifford mentioned that it was well furnished with inhabitants of English, Scottish and Irish, whereas by 1622 it was noted that its 54 houses were inhabited for the most part with English, so the Irish seemed to be mostly gone. And the same was the case in Donegal town. They had 30 houses rather than 54, but again there had been Irish there in 1611. By 1622 not much sign of them. An order was given to the planters in Derry which stated that they shouldn't take on Irish apprentices but rather source underprivileged children from England for this purpose rather than bringing in Irish ones. And there's cartographic evidence as well depicting Irish-style vernacular buildings inside towns. There's this map of Carrickfergus, a lovely map I'm sure a lot of you know, from 1560, and you can see these kind of Irish-style dwellings. Now, as Dave mentioned earlier on, that's not necessarily indicative that there are Irish people living in them. It's indicative of the people that had available to build houses for them. So it's not necessarily the same thing. But it does give you some idea. And the same with Armagh. This is a map we saw earlier on. Again, up here, these sort of more Irishy vernacular style housing. And so for example, in Ballyshannon in 1622, there were 30 houses built in the Irish style, but they were inhabited mostly by English soldiers, with a few Irish, but mostly English soldiers living in the Irish style house. And just to conclude, despite all of these setbacks and difficulties, I think it must be argued, I think, that the system of corporate towns in the Ulster Plantation was ultimately successful. And the greatest argument in support of the success of the plantation and these towns is the fact that they're still there. And that many of them, up until fairly recently, continued to hold corporate style structures with town councils in the Republic and up here up until the 70s as well. And the towns, especially the town centres, are still laid out, I think, in much the same way as they had been 400 years ago. And as I chose the Derry one, but you could really choose an awful lot of plantation towns, particularly in the centre of the towns, and say, where is the church? The buildings may have changed, but the streetscapes are generally in the same layout. And so I think the people who lived there when these towns were first granted corporation status 400 odd years ago will still recognise the streetscapes, I think, as many of them lie today. And the fact that these towns have retained much of their physical, corporate and cultural identities, I think, is testament to the success of the ventures begun there just over 400 years ago. Thank you very much.